your future. You know, very often we mention there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6 that these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. What Paul is doing is listing a number of well-known events from the Old Testament. And what he says to Christians is, these things have been written to warn us. They are admonitions. They're given as warnings so that we not participate in those very things. And what he also does is point out that the things that these people engaged in that we're warned against resulted in their death in each of these instances. So it's sort of staggering when we think about it. We look at that and we conclude also from Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 that those things that were written before are written for our learning. But my question is, do we learn from those things? My question is, do we actually make a point to recognize the danger of these sins that are listed here in 1 Corinthians 10, and do we actually make it an effort to avoid those at all costs? Now what I want to do is I want to put up again the verses that Jalen read here from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and I want us to focus upon those. If you don't feel comfortable looking at the screen, get out your Bible. This is the New King James Version. As a matter of fact, it may be even more advantageous for you to hold the Bible in front of you and look at these. But I want to highlight something that has been said here in verse 11. All these things happened to them as examples. Now, they really happened to them, but they serve as examples to those of us, to those who were Paul's first readers of that book, and to us as well. And he says they were written for our admonition. And so again, these are written for our warning. Now, not counting the verses that precede these, verses 1 through 6, but let's just focus upon these few verses here. Now, I want to ask you a question about those. How many sins do you see in these verses? Now, I know I've got the screen up there blocked just a little bit with a starburst, but look at your Bible there. Now, how many sins do you actually recognize that Paul mentions in these verses 7 through 11? Because he tells us that these are sins that we need to be avoiding. That, these are sins that God is warning us about participating in. Now, if you looked at those and you said, well, there are 4 sins listed there, you would be correct. Because Paul uses 4 events from the Old Testament and tells us these are things that need to be avoided. Now, let me remove that, and we'll just begin to look at these. He says, in the first place, do not become idolaters. And he's referring to an event back in the Old Testament where even immediately after leaving Egypt, that the Israelites became idolaters. And he said, as a matter of fact, it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. That identifies very clearly the event that he's talking about. That's recorded in Exodus chapter 32, when Moses was on the mountain receiving the commandments from God. And he says there in verses 6 and 7 of Exodus 32, then they arose early the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now he's talking about here sensually rose up to play. He's not talking about just going out here and playing kickball or playing volleyball. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking about they were sensuously, sexually engaging in these activities and doing so with the abandonment of children. And he says, and the Lord said to Moses, get down, or go get down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. Now what Paul is doing here, he says, now you people need not become idolaters. Don't behave like these childish people. So that's a sin. Well, why would I do that? Well, obviously that was a problem then. And as a matter of fact, John tells us in 1 John chapter 5, the very last verse, keep yourself from idols. So it's a possibility. Well, what's another sin that's listed there? Well, he lists the sin of sexual immorality, or as the old King James Version uses the word, translates the word porneia as fornication. Now again, he's talking about something that was well documented in Jewish history. as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Now, if you go back to the event that he's talking about in Numbers chapter 25, you find that this is a time that the Israelites engaged in fornication with the women of Moab, something God said do not ever do. And yet they did. Well, God was disgusted with that, and 23,000 lost their lives because of that, and some of them in a very hideous kind of way. But, Paul says, don't you do this. As a matter of fact, this is not the first place that Paul says that. It's not the only place, rather, that Paul says that. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18, Paul says, flee fornication. Keep yourself from sexual immorality. And that would include a litany of things, whether we're talking about premarital sex, adultery, or homosexuality, or pornographic use, or just keep yourself from these things. Well, you see what happened? You see what happened in the Old Testament? God says you avoid these things. Then he also says something that somewhat is a surprise, because we don't very often look at this as though it's something that we can do. He says, nor tempted let us not tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Now that too is an interesting occurrence in the Old Testament, because this is referring to something that occurred back in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 16 that really references something that happened in the book of Exodus chapter 17 and verse 7. And so what the people were doing were demanding that God prove himself. Show us, God, that you're with us. And they were destroyed by serpents because of that. Jesus points out to the devil, it is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And so anytime that we are demanding that God prove himself to us, we're tempting God. And it's something that we are demanded by God not to do. Now, we can do that in a number of ways, and I'm not going to necessarily get into a whole list of things that we could do to tempt God in that way. But when we have to demand proof from God that he cares for us by, God, if you care for me, you're going to give me this, that, or the other. God, if you care for me and you're really my God, then you're going to prevent me from having this, that, or the other. This is a way to tempt God. And we are commanded by God to avoid that sin. So there are 3 sins that are listed here, but let's look at the 4th. He said, nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all the sins that have been listed here attack the goodness of God. Every single sin listed here in 1 Corinthians 10 indicates a lack of trust in God. Now what Paul is doing here is he is referencing again a well-known event that occurred in Israel's history. Nor complain, as some of them also complain. Now let's first identify what it means to complain. Complain is an interesting word. Now the King James Version uses the word murmur. Now we don't use that word quite as often as they did in 1611 when the King James Version was translated. We usually think about a murmur as being a heart murmur or something like that. But murmur or complaining translates a word in the Greek that means to complain, criticize, whine, nitpick in low, mumbling terms. Don't you find that to be an interesting definition of the word? It's a word that we might use today. We might substitute today the word bellyache. That's what a bellyache. He just complains, bellyache, whines, nitpicks about everything. And that was occurring in the Old Testament. And really, he's referencing here the events that took place back in the book of Numbers, especially chapter 16. Now, you also might include chapter 14 here, but he's really referencing an event that occurred in Numbers chapter 16. Now, let me remind you what was going on in these 2 chapters. In Numbers 14, you may recall, this is when the spies came back from spying out the land, and 10 of them gave a bad report. 10 of them said, we can't take that land because the giants are there, and we, as God's people, cannot defeat them. And so they began to murmur, and they began to complain about this. Verse 2 says, of Numbers 14, so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night, and all the children of Israel complained against Moses. Moses, you're going to lead us into that. You're going to lead us into our death. It would have been better if we'd stayed back in Egypt and just been slaves for the rest of our lives. How dare you bring us out here and let us die like this at the hands of these giants? And it's pointed out that if you have this kind of attitude, you know what? You're really a rebel. Verse 9, only do not rebel against the Lord. You people got to understand the Lord's with us. You can't complain about that, but that's what they were doing. But really the event that he has in mind seems to be in the 16th chapter of the book of Numbers. This is the complaining that was driven by a man by the name of Korah. Korah begins to complain, and he draws in some people after him. Let's notice now, Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Korath, the son of Levi, with Dathan, and Abiram, the son of Eliab, and On, the son of Pelah, sons of Reuben. These are the ones that began this campaign of murmur. This campaign of complaint. And this is what the Apostle Paul is making reference to. And what the conclusion that he has about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is, hey, don't do it. Don't do this. That's easy to do. As a matter of fact, it's very easy to do, and often it's very tempting to do. But you know, God says don't do this. Now we understand the need not to commit fornication. Don't do this. Now some people do, even though it's clear. And we understand the admonition not to commit, idolatry. And this is something that people do. And, we could talk about these others. Don't tempt the Lord. But yet people do. And yet when it comes to this admonition here, do not complain, it's something people just ignore. People don't recognize that it's wrong. The thing about it that we need to recognize is, even though it may not rank very high on our list of don't do, it ranks high on God's list of do not do this. Because when we begin to recognize the dangers associated with this, we recognize that it is a destructive sin. It destroys tranquility wherever it is occurring. It destroys the tranquility of a neighborhood. If you live in a neighborhood, in a subdivision or a housing addition of some sort, and you've got somebody on your block that is a constant complainer, he complains about dogs in his yard, he complains about kids playing in the street, he complains about everything, you see the tranquility of that neighborhood destroyed. People are not getting along. There's destruction in that neighborhood. We understand that when we think about it from that perspective. It creates chaos at work. We may have a working environment where we've got some knucklehead there that just fusses and complains and gripes and murmurs and bellyaches about everything. And nobody wants to be around him, and those who do will find they're drawn into that, and it creates a chaotic situation at work. And it does that at home. When you've got a husband and a wife, and we often call the constant complainers in the home, we call them those people who are nagging. And I'm going to tell you something, nagging goes both ways. And when that nagging or that complaining or that murmuring and that bellyaching is just something that continues on and on, Just like at work, you're going to have a chaotic situation. And just like in a neighborhood, you're going to have disruption. If this is all that goes on in the home, statements like, well, you're never home, you never fix yourself up anymore, you never said an intelligent word in all of your life, and on, you go think. And I'm going to tell you, it will not be long before that marriage is destroyed. Because murmuring is a sin that is destructive in any kind of collective atmosphere that you will find yourself in. Jesus said that a house divided against itself, Matthew 12 and verse 25, cannot stand. You see that in a home, you see it in a neighborhood, you see it at work, you see it in a nation. This is we call ourselves one nation under God. We're no longer one nation any longer, especially under God, but we're not one nation. You've got politicians that are seeking to divide us. Divide us geographically. Divide us racially. Divide us ethnicity-wise. Divide us economically. When you got people talking about the 1%, all they're trying to do is divide. They're trying to cause chaos and destruction. When you talk about people, Black Lives Matter or White Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or no lives, they're just simply trying to divide. And it's destructive. It is rebellion to the core. And this is why, when you think about it in that general broad sense, this is why God gives a warning to Christians. God gives a warning to churches. Do not do this. It is destructive, and it creates chaos. It creates division, and it is rebellion. Do not do this. Now, I want to note with you a couple of passages in the New Testament. Let's notice first Philippians chapter 2. And notice what the Apostle Paul says, do all things without complaining and disputing. Well, if I do all things without complaining or disputing, how does that benefit me? That you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Now let's look at that in an interesting sort of way. Because what we're going to find here is that murmurers, those who do complain, and those who do grumble, and those who do dispute, bear the opposite characteristics that we are to bear. Now let's take, for instance, we are to be blameless. Murmurers are, on the other hand, guilty before God. Because if I don't murmur, and I don't complain, and I don't dispute, then that makes me blameless before God. But if I do, then I'm guilty before God. Furthermore, we are to be harmless. And if I am a complainer, then I am not harmless, I'm harmful, or I'm dangerous to the church. You see, this is kind of an interesting way to look at it, but when we recognize that to do things without, then that makes us this way. Well, if we're doing things by complaining and murmuring, then the opposite is true. We are to be without fault. But you know what? A murmurer is not without sin. This violates the will of God. Even though it may not rate very high on our list of don't do's, it's still a sin. We are to be as lights shining in a dark world. But rather than being lights, a complainer is basically contributing to the darkness that exists. So don't do this. Paul said, you know what? Just take a look back in the Old Testament. Go back and study Numbers 16. Hey, don't do this. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But I want to look at another passage found in the New Testament over in the book of Jude. Jude is just one chapter. But in verses 10 and 11 we read, but these speak evil of whatever they do not know. And whatever they know naturally, like brute beasts, in these things they corrupt themselves. Woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the era of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korah. So he's talking about the same event that Paul was mentioning in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, back in Numbers 16. Well, let's notice again. By looking at this, we find that murmurers are just, the opposite of what we're to be. Murmurers are those who speak evil. They're sinning with the tongue. Murmurers are speaking things they do not know, and it often stems from a lack of scriptural understanding. Don't know what they're talking about. They're like brute beasts. They're behaving like animals that turn on each other. You ever watched any National Geographics or pulled up on YouTube about the animals in Africa? You got a pack of hyenas that will, attack a water buffalo or something, and they'll do so as a collective group, but then when the animal is down and they start feeding, they turn on each other. Well, that's what Jude says that murmuring, complaining is like. It's like turning on each other, biting and devouring one another. And these perished in the rebellion of Korah. As with Korah, God will punish the murmurer. God will punish the complainer. Now let's think about those. Numbers chapter 16 and verse 32. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up. 250 initially led away in the rebellion and the complaining of Korah. 250 were, the ground just opened up and swallowed them. They're done. God said, I'm done with you. But it didn't end there. Verse 49, now those who died in the plague, they continued murmuring, by the way. And those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the Korah incident. And so, we may not think this is a big deal, but you know what? It is a big deal. Jesus taught us in Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 and 37, that every idle word we speak we will be judged by the words that we speak. This is divisive. And the Bible teaches us that God hates those who sow discord among brethren. It is rebellion. And rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So I'll tell you what let's do. Let's open our Bibles up, the 16th chapter, the book of Numbers, and I'm going to show you from that chapter just how murmuring / rebellion / division develops. It's kind of an interesting situation. Because number one, what you have is the organizing of accomplices. It always takes an organizing of people to go along with the complainer. Going back to Numbers chapter 16, we'll note in verse 1 again, now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan, and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Pelah, sons of Reuben, took men. Now I want you to think about it here. This begins right here. And I'm going to tell you something. It always results in something that is destructive. Hear what the disgruntled is never content to be disgruntled all by himself. He's got to find allies. Korah was disgruntled. He wanted to take the authority of Moses. This was something that was on his mind. But he could not do this by himself. And so what he then begins to do is organize some of those who would be supporters of him. It would be sort of like, let me see if I can find anybody to agree with me. Now who could that be? Now maybe he tries several others before he centers his attention upon these four. I don't know. I don't know. But I tell you what he does, he rounds up what I might refer to as just the usual suspects. Abiram, On, and Dathan. Now Korah, his problem was different than those other guys. But his problem was, I don't like the way that Moses and Aaron are doing what they're doing. I don't like it. Now maybe he gets those guys together and he said, now I don't like what they're doing. What do you fellas think about that? Did you ever think that Moses and Aaron may be just usurping their authority just a little bit? Have you ever given any thought to what these guys are doing and how this is not the right way to do this? There's a better way to get this done. Now, maybe, like I said, maybe he talked to others before settling upon these, but the seeds of rebellion are being sown. And this is the way that it happens in every generation. If I'm disgruntled, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to seek out somebody else that's disgruntled, and like birds of a feather, we're going to flock together. And that's the way that Korah was doing it. And today, if I'm seeking that, then I'll do it in a social setting. I'll do it in visiting in the hall. I'll do it on the phone, texting, however I want to do it. But I'm going to find those who are agreeing with me. And I'll pick an issue, exactly like Korah did. I'll pick an issue and then I'll treat it just like a scab. I'll scratch it off until it bleeds. And it will become a festering sore, and the peace and the harmony will be disrupted. This is why God says don't do this. It is a destructive policy. Now believe me, there are going to be problems. You look in the church in Acts chapter 6, the church at Jerusalem. There was a problem that resulted in complaining. You remember the Hellenist or the Grecian widows complained, or the Grecians complained that their widows were being neglected. So there was a complaint that was brought. But rather than this thing erupting like it did with Korah, those Christians decided we're going to solve the matter. And so what did they do? When the complaint was laid down that there's something wrong here, what did they do? They addressed the matter and they solved it. As a matter of fact, the apostles said, well, I'll tell you what you do. You look out among you and you select 7 men to take care of this matter. And what's interesting about that is that the 7 men they selected to take care of it came from among the Grecians, came from among the complainers. You got an issue? Take care of it. You got a problem? Take care of it. This is how it's done. And you know what? They solved the matter and peace and harmony prevailed. It's a beautiful thing. It really is. You know, I often tell people, you sometimes hear people in churches, well, I tell you what, that's just the most unfriendly bunch of people there. Well, hey, take care of it. Brother said the other day, and we met over here, we were talking, and he said that there was a fellow in the congregation there where he was standing back in the corner watching him. He was kind of mingling around, shaking everybody's hand and talking to them. And finally, this brother says to the one doing all the handshaking, he said, I'm just watching you. He said, what are you watching me for? He said, I'm just watching you. He said, why is everybody talking to you and there's nobody talking to me? Everybody's friendly with you, but nobody's friendly with me. He said, well, look where you are. You're standing in the corner. He said, mingle around, stick out your hand. He said, he did this. He said, I stuck my hand out to him. He said, you know what he did? He said, he shook my hand. He said, see, it works. It works. And he said, and now, you know what? He's one of the most friendly guys in the congregation. He said, he's going around talking to everybody. And it works. You see, you can stand back in the corner like this fellow did, and we can complain all day that the church is not friendly. Hey, but get up, stick out your hand, see what happens. It is amazing because it is infectious. Well, see, nobody talked to him. Well, nobody talked to me because I walked out like this. There's a problem in the church at Jerusalem. Take care of the matter. You select some folks and you take care of the matter. Somebody said there's just not enough going on for the young people. We don't have enough. You're not planning anything. Hey, look out among yourselves and take care of it. You got a home. You got opportunities. You see, this is how the matters are taken care of in the New Testament. Somebody said, I don't like the classes in a church somewhere. I just don't like the classes. I don't like the way that things are going. Hey, become a teacher. Show us how to do it. There are solutions to these things. Korah and them, all they were interested in is stirring the pot. Tim was telling me somebody told him that they knew of a church one time that had a number of deacons, and you know how deacons are put in charge of various things? They put a deacon in charge of murmuring. I think he had a problem. Well, Korah was in charge of murmuring. And he looks out and he recruits. And he organizes his accomplices. Now what? Now they begin to work and recruit other complainers. That's the way it goes. Let's notice now, verse 2. And they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, representatives of the congregation, men and women, well-respected people, good people that were drawn into this. Now, you know what's interesting, if you read the history of this, Korah, as we indicated a little earlier, wanted Moses' authority. He wanted to be Moses. But now he recruits some people from the Reubenites. On, Abiram, Dathan, they're Reubenites. What was their grievance? They had a grievance. The Reubenites had a grievance. You know, Reuben, the oldest son, but you know what was interesting about the tribe of Reuben? They received the smallest inheritance. And ooh, that was smart. They received, on the east side of the Jordan, boy, they got the smallest inheritance. Gad got half the tribe of Manasseh got bigger than they. And they got this little inheritance, and they were smarting, and they had a grievance too. It may not have been the same grievance that Korah had, but they had a grievance. And I always found that to be interesting. You know, you take the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Herodians, they didn't like each other. But you know what? When you have a common grievance, it just draws the malcontents together. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Herodians, they set aside their differences to come after Christ, and they did. Now Korah and the Reubenites, they set aside their differences because they have a common enemy. They're coming after Moses, and they're coming after Aaron. Now God says don't do this because of what happened to them. But now you move from organizing to recruiting, and now it's time to throw down the gauntlet. Now it's time to bring it to the forefront. Let's announce let's get it out in the open. Let's lay it on the table. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You take too much upon yourselves. For all the congregation is holy, every one of them. And the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" Now that's kind of, I don't know about you. You know, if you're familiar with Old Testament history, you find out what went on in Exodus 19. You remember when God called the people out of Egyptian captivity, and they came to Mount Sinai. God tells them in Exodus 19, "I'm going to make you a holy nation. You're going to be a kingdom of priests." You know, kind of like some of the same terminology we find in the book of Revelation about Christians. Well, that's what God said to the people of Israel. You're going to be a kingdom of priests. And so what Korah is doing is using that as a scriptural argument against what Moses is doing. Well, Moses, if we're all priests and we're all equal before God, how dare you take this authority that you have? We all have that same amount of authority. And I tell you what's really neat about Korah's argument, I have to say, is that anytime you can kind of couch a complaint in Scripture, it makes it sound pretty good. Now they were wrong, as God is going to prove to them. But that makes it sound better, and it's easier to recruit when you've got a scriptural precedence for that. Now 250 died. God just opened up the ground, Korah and Dathan and the rest and all, they just died. That's how God looked at this. They didn't have a scriptural leg to stand on. This is how God looked at it. But it's not over. It's not over. Because Korah and the guys were able to sow a seed of discontent that spread like poison ivy. Let's notice now how they influenced what I refer to as the naive. After this 250 died, you would have thought that the congregation would have gotten their eyes open. The nation would have recognized, whoa, we are on the wrong track. But verse 41 says, on the next day. They didn't wait a week or two. It was 24 hours, perhaps less. On the next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. Now, who did that? Well, it was God. Moses didn't have anything to do with opening up the ground. It was God who opened up the ground, and these rebels were destroyed. Now the people are complaining that Moses did. And so you see what goes from 1 to 4 to 250 now has infected the entire group of Jews. And God looked at it, I'll tell you what God said. God said, you know what? I'm done with you. I'm done with you. I'm just going to wipe the whole bunch of you off the face of the earth. I'm done with you. And the very ones that they were complaining about, Moses and Aaron, pled with God to spare the people. The very ones that were the object of their complaint were the ones who were responsible for them being able to survive and not be destroyed. And God spared. Well, now there are a lot of them died. Verse 49, those who died in the plague were 14,700. That's besides those who were killed or who died in the Korah incident. So you see, when you read these very simple admonitions that we have in Romans 15 and verse 4, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6 and 13, or verse 6 and 11 rather, then recognize that there's Old Testament precedence for this. And God said, if you engage in this, let me show you what I feel about that. Let me show you how I handled that in the Old Testament, and do not think that you will be guiltless. You see, one complainer, whether it's at home, whether it's in a neighborhood, whether it's on the job, or whether it's in the church, can destroy a lot of good. So that's why we'll close with a reminder of what Paul says. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault, in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. That's the solution. Beautiful solution. So peace and harmony and love and purity. It is what God wants us to be. And it's what we ought to aspire to become. If you're not a Christian today, let me say to you as we close out our remarks this morning, that God loves you and He sent His Son to die for you as that perfect sacrifice. That if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you're willing to repent of your sins, Acts 2 and verse 38, that's turn away from them. And you're willing to confess your faith with the mouth, confession is made unto salvation, Romans 10, verses 9 and 10. And you're willing to humble yourself sufficiently that you surrender to the Lord in water baptism, wherein you contact the blood of Christ. You can be raised to walk in newness of life. You can become a Christian. Yes, there are going to be things that you have to face, things that you'll have to endure, that will create sometimes within you a sense of angst. These things can be taken care of. in the way that God intends for them to be taken care of. Read Acts 6. You can see. Don't you want to be a Christian? Don't you want to go to heaven? I trust that you will, and I trust that you'll make that known right now as together we stand as we sing.